I want to talk about the importance of gumption. And, frankly, I just made up this term in the last 6 months, but I think it reflects a lot in what I'm trying to do and sort of tell a story of that. And I think it has combinations of the idea of sort of grit with this Angela Duckworth's idea, also sort of, perspective or thinking of something and having intention for a very, very long time, sort of the idea of vision, and then as well modesty, because I think it's very important, or humility is very important to sort of realize these things, that to be humble, and to know that, hey, you know what, these things take a long time, and you might not necessarily be good enough at this moment, but that doesn't necessarily matter. You might not necessarily have all of the resources at this moment, but it's not the end all and be all. So the idea behind grit is that, it's almost like delay of gratification. This idea that you keep working at something no matter the adversity that you actually feel, the adversity that you actually experience, but you keep doing at that. And that is a somewhat of a predictor of future success. There's a whole cluster of terminologies, ideas, all related around the idea of sort of waiting for tomorrow and working towards tomorrow, and working sort of diligently towards tomorrow, and sort of sacrificing for today for the thing that you're going to experience tomorrow. And the one particular topic that has become popular is the idea of grit, where you're thinking and working towards something, and it doesn't matter about the adversities that you actually experience, but you get up and you just keep going at it one day at a time. And it's a huge predictor of sort of success outcomes at the education level, in terms of your career prospects, in terms of your relationships. There's pretty substantial evidence. I would say that it's sort of clustered around the same sort of idea. You're just making these trade-offs for tomorrow, given that, you can be better off by making some sort of sacrifice today. That's sort of the economist way to think about things. But I think it's very true. But the sort of thing that is missing with grit, I think, is perspective or vision or a mission or something along those lines, where you're thinking about, hey, what can I do in the long term that actually matters? What can I do that doesn't fit with today, doesn't jive with today, but you're thinking about where you can actually go and apply yourself on a regular basis. And I think that combination of applying yourself for a vision that may not necessarily make sense today is an important, very important combination of pursuing something that is ambiguous and sort of difficult to actually obtain. So the question is why is gumption so important to creating a startup or doing anything in the business world? And the reason is it's often lacking. So you might have the ability to have grit, but then you're sort of focused on one particular, you're focused on doing things that are within the realm of what is useful or what has been done before, right? So you're not really reaching out to something and doing something new. And so having the mission, the vision, the sort of idea to do something that is different, as well as a combination, is important, so that you keep sort of pursuing that particular thing. You need to have that sort of meaning behind something. And I think that's sort of a critical idea, is recognizing that meaning is important behind creating things. And it's not necessarily that, it's not necessarily that just having meaning in of itself, or a mission, or whatever you want to call it, right? That sort of, there's something there, right? That could be called culture. All of these things are kind of, I think, fairly similar. They're sort of in-betweenness, the interspatialness between just human beings, right? Where you're thinking of this sort of, you can't measure it, you can't put your finger on it. It's completely made up in a lot of ways, but if you just have that, and you see a lot of dreamers, right? Those are the ones that actually just sit there and dream about different things, and they wonder about, I should be doing this, I should be doing that, and they actually never get anything done. So it's the idea that you actually have to put pen to paper, or, actually get to work. Pitter patter, let's get at her, right? Where you get up and you get going, no matter what is happening in your life, and you keep pursuing that particular thing. So gumption, I think, is critically important. And that was one of the challenge is that I saw early on with the Reciprocity Project. Remember, I was trying to get a team together, put it, actually create this thing. And I think people saw the sort of mission of it. They sort of saw what I was doing, but then they lacked the sort of idea, I guess it's grit, or the idea that you have to work, and you have to sit down and actually get things done. You have to do activities to actually get things done. And it's not necessarily just dreaming about something. And I see that as a critical missing thing. So I guess this is lesson 3 or 4. I don't know where we are with that right now, but the critical problem with entrepreneurship and how we teach entrepreneurship, and the ideas behind entrepreneurship, how people sort of imagine them, is that nobody's actually putting pen to, they're not actually sitting down and doing it and going through the maddening process of figuring things out. We have these sort of curriculums at school that are about, we learn about these sort of entrepreneurial ventures. We learn about, managers, and nobody's actually putting it together and creating something. And this is an interesting thing. So for me, not a lot of professors that actually do this, right? I sit down and do this. But here's the thing that's even more challenging is that, I view myself as a research professor as like first and foremost, and that's the reason why I'm actually doing this. And so the question, and I'll talk about that in future chapters, it's like, how do you actually do this at the same time and not get sort of caught up, I guess, in sort of pursuing it all the time, right? And so that's the challenge with doing something is, coming back to that conversation of we teach people what it looks like, but we don't teach people what it feels like and you go through. And it's kind of very similar to this idea I was just, talking about with the interstitial stuff, right? The in-between. It's the same thing. You feel a lot different. The experience is a lot different. So it's not necessarily you have this sort of really cool idea and everybody loves it, right? Like that's not the story at all. In fact, and I'll talk about this in the future, is that you have this idea that you think is great, but you have to violate a lot of norms. And you have to have, it's not necessarily, I think it's confidence, but something where you just keep going with something. And you keep pursuing it. And that's why it's really important to have both the idea of mission towards something and then as well as gumption. So, for the other thing, and so the last thing I wanted to point out before I get into talking about myself, which seems really weird. So the other thing is, why do you actually need this sort of mission for the future? It's because you're creating something from nothing and nobody knows what this looks like. And it's kind of in your head and it's hard to communicate what you're actually trying to do. And the only way that you can sort of show to the outside world what you're trying to do is actually just keep doing it, right? Like that's one of the ways that you build culture. It's one of the ways that you build something that people believe in, is you just repeatedly do it time and time again until it becomes something that everybody recognizes that you actually do and becomes your thing. And that is kind of a challenging thing to do, right? Where you're doing something just for the sake of actually doing it. And then people recognize, oh, this thing is actually legitimate. And then perhaps one day people might actually jump on and do something with it. So why has gumption been so important in my own life? So my story, I guess, is, it's been, a lot of people have sort of resources at their fingertips. But I want to sort of say that has not been my story. When I grew up, I remembered being absolutely last in everything, right? If you sort of checkbox all of the things that people would be like, I don't know if this person's going to do anything in their life, you'd probably sort of checkbox absolutely everything, right? So, maybe I'll start from the broader. So my grandparents on my mom's side, my dad, I don't know anything beyond this too far. But my grandpa, he was a World War II vet and goes over, crosses in Normandy, spends first of all, he joins when he's 17 years old before you can actually join. And then he goes over, is there for 2 years, is missing in action, and then comes back and is a complete wreck. He basically can't do a lot. He can't really function that well. He's got odd jobs for the rest of his life. And I just remember him a lot, just not being capable of doing anything, just kind of laying around. And he also was an alcoholic. So he would go on what we call as benders in our family, and he would disappear for a week. And I remember many times growing up where my parents would have to go look for him, that there would be a thing that would happen. And they have a big family, right? So my grandparents have a big family, and I probably can get the number wrong, but I think there's 7 kids in their family. And it's a big family. So there was my grandma, who, she was an orphan, very early on. Neither of them went and finished high school. And it wasn't part of our life. We actually lived in northern Ontario. So there's this little place called Eagle River, which the nearest town is 20 kilometers away. And that nearest town, is the sort of big city. Eagle River has one little stop in that town. And my mom tells stories where she would have to walk from her dirt floor house, basically a dirt floor house, to the schoolhouse, which was 5 miles away, just to go to school. So my mom actually, because of the sort of journey of that, in high school was 20 kilometers away. She didn't finish high school. I think she finished in about grade 10 and stopped going in grade 10. So on my dad's side, my grandpa and my grandma at the time, they emigrated from Poland in 1935, I believe was the year. There was kind of a staggered start, but they come over from Poland because the rumor was that they got in trouble with the police in Poland. Well, I wonder why that actually was. So they come over, immigrate, and they they homestead in Vermilion Bay, Ontario, which is very rural and is about 20 kilometers away from Eagle River. Vermilion Bay is maybe got an extra store more than Eagle River. And so they have to clear this house, and there's 9 kids. And they had a shack. It was not bigger than what you'd see with a sort of garden shack. That was their house, where they had 9 kids, and 2 of them. And they were very hard workers with who they actually were. They're Polish immigrants. They worked really hard, but they were also pretty not nice parents. They were very, very mean. Sort of typical as you think as old world style parenting. And many of their kids left home early on. My dad left fairly early on. He was almost the youngest. I think he was the second youngest of these 9 kids. But there was just a lot of challenges that he had to face, and not nice behaviors that he had to face. So my dad was always he was a great dad, but always standoffish in a lot of ways. And I think it was largely from growing up in a sort of Polish immigrant family. When he was younger, he didn't speak English, and Canada spoke English, so he had to learn how to speak English as a little one. And so there was a lot of challenges that he faced. So he didn't finish high school at all because of the challenges that he faced, and he went and got a job at the local pulp and paper mill. So my family, my immediate family, all of us, so there's 6 kids. So I hesitate with telling the story, but I think it's really important. My parents couldn't have a baby very early on, so my mom got married. She was 16 years old, and these standards today was pretty early, but that was actually somewhat of a norm at that point and in that part of the world. So she got married earlier. My aunt actually, I think, was younger yet. I think she was 14 years old when she got married. And she was part of the sort of old world Polish family. But my mom, she got married quite young, and they wanted to have kids, and they couldn't have kids. So they adopted, actually it was one of these stories where, where the it's actually really not nice, and I hesitate to sort of talk about it, and how it formed. I've found out, but so in the early 60s and 70s, there's I think it was called the Scoop, is what that sort of name was. But there was this sort of, and I feel a great deal of guilt for this, in a lot of ways, but I know my parents were doing the best that they could at this time. But what happened was that the Roman Catholic Church, in the government of Canada, they scooped up a lot of native reserves or children from native reserves in our area, and there was I believe she was Cree. Was her background. My sister's background was Cheryl, so they adopted a girl who was Cree. So she didn't look like she's a Ojibwe Cree, so very much northern Ontario. And she's from one of these reserves there. And I don't know anything about her family that much. It does make me feel guilty. It makes me feel really bad. But at the same time, I know that my parents were knowing that they were doing the right thing. And I think perhaps it was, but just everything going behind it is just very challenging. And I deeply apologize if anybody reads this or listens to this if they feel offended. But this is just what happened in our life. And so they adopted Cheryl and raised her as her own. And then eventually they started having their own kids. So my oldest sister, Danette, was born shortly after Cheryl was adopted. And then from there, it's hard to talk about. They started to have more kids, and they ended up having, 6 kids altogether. But here's the thing. So when I was about to be born, my mom was still pregnant with me. Cheryl was 12, 13 years old. And of course she had challenges with figuring out what her identity was. And so she goes to a reserve, I believe it was in Grassy Narrows, which is a small reserve outside of Kenora, Ontario. And she goes and she runs into trouble, and she was actually murdered. And I don't know the full details of how everything went. I don't know if I feel comfortable with taking a real deep dive, and it's hard to find. I've tried to sort of look into that. It's hard to find, but it's not a nice story in any sort of way. So I was born into a lot of trauma in our family. A great deal of trauma in our family as my parents were dealing with grieving. And I think we became much more insular as a family because of that, because it was a really challenging thing, and my parents became very protective of all of us. And I think because of that, we had a great deal of it was extremely loving family. Nobody really, it was my parents treated us really right, but at the same time they were quite restrictive on a lot of things. And I look and I think now, I'm like, of course I would be too, right? We also had some family violence, not my immediate family, but extended family. So they were quite frightened of the outside world. And I won't tell too much behind that, but just, they were quite frightened of the outside world and what the outside world would actually treat you like. And I think, of course, right? Like, I think that was probably the right thing to do, and I would do the exact same thing. And so we didn't venture out a lot. So what we ended up doing, I was the youngest of all of these kids, and my siblings had a hard time. So my oldest sister, she leaves when she's 15 years old, and she was struggling, I think, with a lot of things, and I think partly because she was around when Cheryl was around. That's a lot to deal with. And I think, like, the guilt that I feel and she probably felt, oh man, you have no idea. So, I remember writing letters to my sister when I was 7 because she was gone, my oldest sister, and dealing with all of this, right? But my parents were very protective. And they also didn't go to high school and finish up high school until, I'll tell you that story in a minute. I started studying for high school. So in my last couple of years, I started studying all the time. And the reason why I started studying all the time was my parents... So I ended up not having a lot of friends in grade 9 and grade 10. I was very much alone, and I felt bad about myself. This was like a thing that I've been dealing with for a long time. But realizing that, hey, wait a minute, now I realize, like, that's actually a good thing for me because I'm comfortable with being by myself. I can actually kind of just be my thing and do my thing. But at the time, that was very difficult to deal with. It sort of brings, some trauma with you. And as I'm dealing with this, as I'm dealing with this, and I didn't have a lot of friends, I started thinking about, hey, if I just perfect myself, if I think of myself as like, I can do all these things and perfect myself, then I can, maybe make some more friends. That was sort of my thought process. And the more that I perfect myself, the better off I will actually be. And the more that, people would love me, basically, is the story. And as I was doing that, I started thinking about, okay, well, what about school? I got into exercise. I was weightlifting on a regular basis. That's sort of somewhat typical sort of story of teenage angst. But then I got into school and I realized, wait a minute, if I study really hard, maybe I would be, the top of my class, and I would be like super popular, and everybody would sort of come cheering for me. Like, what high school do I live in, right? Like, it's Northern Ontario. That was not the thing to think about, but that was my thought process. And so I started studying very hard, and I worked, and then I got into a good university, the University of Waterloo. And then I had the same, somewhat similar experiences, but not quite. So my first year I kind of bombed, but then I had to get that gumption again and work until I got until I started doing better in my engineering program. I did a chemical engineering, but I also had this sort of gumption thing. I had this roommate, and we sort of talked about, hey, let's do a sociology degree at the same time and try to double major. So both of us had very similar trajectories, and I don't know whose idea it was, but I just sort of, had this idea of just doing these things because it sounded interesting. So I did a sociology degree. It was a couple of courses short of majoring in it, but I did a sociology degree at the same time because I was interested in people as I was thinking about chemical engineering. Now, why is gumption so important at this moment? Gumption, in all respects, was about moving on to something different and sort of putting in the work and knowing that it requires a great deal of work with a vision to actually get there. So at the time, I wanted to manage something, so I thought it would be important to understand about people. Or it wasn't necessarily, the reason why I became a chemical engineer was because I understood that in our town, that was the pulp and paper mill. Somebody had a good job of a pulp and paper mill, right? You might be the boss at the mill. This was a time that the mill in our town was everything, and it still is. And so that's how you sort of had career mobility. And so I thought, well, if I did a sociology degree, I'd understand about people that much more to be a better manager. Now, as I did that, I realized that took a lot of gumption because I would take courses that were much harder, much more difficult than what the sort of norm was in the engineering program, where you take the easiest courses adjacent to what you're doing. So I was taking like sociological theory and these sort of difficult courses. I took a gender course, which was really interesting, just very different. And I think the only reason why I did that is because I had gumption, that I was sort of pursuing something for some longer term goal, but also knowing that it just takes a lot of work to pursue and work at this thing. So what ends up happening is then I wanted to get into graduate school because I actually had a internship at it's called co-op, and the University of Waterloo has co-op programs. So you work for 4 months and then you go to school for 4 months for 5 years. And one of the places where I stayed, I was actually in a lot of research and development positions. And so one of the places I was at, it was a software company doing a lot of research and development in chemical processing. And there's a number of PhDs that were there. And I also had a roommate, one of the times, that was a PhD in mathematics. And I thought that this was really interesting, right? I rented a room and this guy had a PhD in mathematics, and I thought it was really interesting what he was doing. So I went and signed up to get a master's, and then eventually a PhD from University of Western Ontario, from the Ivy Business School. So I decided during my PhD program that I wanted to understand. So I was doing a strategy PhD. It was sort of innovation focused at the time. They didn't have anything like that, but it was called strategy, general management. So at the time I was interested in doing, I was like, with my gumption, I was like curious about the world. So I was like, okay, well, why didn't I get double major in a finance degree as well, a PhD in finance? So I actually go about of doing that, and I think I was a course short. And the reason why I didn't finish was because one of the people somebody recommended it's not going to matter anyways. And I don't think that that's actually true. But I took a ton of extra courses in econometrics and all this sort of very heavily econ oriented. And the whole time I didn't have the background in doing any of that stuff, but I was, somewhat lost. But I sort of figured it out and got through this. But, that was the beginning of it. But then during my PhD process, when I was starting to write my thesis, I wanted to race through it. I was always kind of the person that wanted to get through things very quickly. I thought I was, a quote-unquote star in my own mind, right? And then I wanted to push through these things. I wanted to finish this in 3 years, and I realized it wasn't going to happen. And it wasn't because of my inability, because I worked a lot. It was simply because it's not the nature of the beast. It's not what you do in research. And so as I got about, it was about my 4th year into it, I started to lose a tremendous amount of faith in myself, because I was realizing that this was never ending and I didn't see the goals. I didn't see anything. I was sort of losing that gumption, that willingness to sort of do something, to pursue it. And, even though I was getting up and working, I lost faith completely in who I was. And I was a very somewhat hollow person. And it wasn't until about my 3rd year so I ended up trying to get a job, couldn't get a job. So here I was with all these sort of credentials and all this kind of stuff. It was the financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis was there, and there was no jobs. I remember watching the job board essentially shrivel up to no jobs at all. And academia is still sort of paying the price of the 2008 financial crisis. It still is a lot more difficult to get jobs since then. I remember watching this and going through this experience of just losing faith completely in myself and who I was. I had a lot of gumption at one point, and I realized I was doing everything right, as in my mind, trying to do everything right. And I realized that it wasn't equating to the right outcomes. Nothing was happening from it. I was actually somewhat failing with who I was, and it felt not great. And so even though I had grit at that moment to sort of push through things, I didn't feel normal. I wasn't feeling right in my head. Doing all of this coursework and sort of seeing things disappear, doing everything that you think that you should be doing, right? Trying to work with great people, trying to, do extra work, trying to go to the best schools. The Ivy Business School is the best one in Canada, or one of the best ones in Canada. Trying to sort of checkmark box all of those things where you're the best at everything. And when I go through it, and I go through the process, it was soul-wrecking, where I realized I put in all this work doing all this stuff, and it doesn't equate to the outcomes that you actually expect. And I think this is really normal with entrepreneurship processes, with doing anything that's hard and difficult, drug development, anything that takes extended amount of time, research and development, where you go through things and it doesn't work out. So if you just had grit, and if you're just focused on grit, you would actually get into this work mentality, and you just work at stuff. But that neglects the sort of feelings that you have, neglects the sort of psychological processes that you go through, neglects all of the sort of stuff that's important to get you getting up and getting going and having that gumption again. So it was about my third year of being at as a professor at the school that I'm currently at. And about the third year, I realized that I felt really terrible about myself, looking back during the PhD, and I wanted to figure out how I can solve that problem of not feeling so terrible about myself. And I don't think that was a good thing. I thought I was even though I was probably one of the more talented, I thought in my mind, obviously, right? I was fairly talented. And it still had negative outcomes, right? The process didn't work out. It wasn't sort of efficient like you think it would be, even though I did get a job, but it took me an awful long time. So there's a moment, this is a digression. There was a moment where I was actually going to take a job in a factory because I couldn't get any work anywhere else. And I'd spent 5 years doing my PhD, and then I was doing a postdoc, which essentially was just like, I need to actually get more research done and get some of this stuff out. And so there was a moment where it was December of 2011. I had in my mind of, if I don't get a job, and I applied everywhere, if I don't get a job, I'm going to quit. And then I'm going to work in a factory. When I ended up getting a job within a matter of, I think it was a month before that deadline, because I had two small kids, and we're really struggling with things. Actually, one small kid, and my wife was very, very pregnant at that time. We were struggling with things, and this was not working out. So I thought, coming back to 3 years into my PhD, or into my professor position, I thought, why can't I build this thing? I'm teaching about entrepreneurship, teaching about innovation, strategy. Why can't I actually build a platform that reduces all of the challenges that we face and minimizes some of that through technical solutions, right? So I'm software background. I did a lot of software development. I thought, I could build this thing. And so I actually started building it. But when I started building it, I realized that, I wasn't telling the story about gumption and how important that actually is. I wasn't sort of reflecting on who I was and why gumption is so important to getting up and getting going. It's not just about the sort of work part of it, but it's also this sort of emotional part of it, and dealing with how do you have something where you just keep going. And I think that's the important part of what we need in terms of training on, is how do we pursue, how do we have that gumption where we not only work at stuff and do that constant work, but have that sort of mission towards something that's important. So for me, with the Reciprocity Project, it's thinking of all of the moments that I didn't feel good, and talking to somebody that was going through that same experience. It's about thinking that there's this huge gap, this huge hole where there is a lot of discussion about productivity, but nobody teaches you what that means. What is that? There's all sorts of discussion in research in academia about productivity, even in entrepreneurship, about getting things done. Nobody goes through and helps you with that. You're kind of just, there's this vacant hole of what that actually means, what it looks like, how does that feel, right? And if I can be the one person that sort of tells this so you can follow along and know that you're totally normal, there's something about that where you feel like you're normal, where you feel okay with yourself, right? I think that's super important. And, coming back to my earlier years, why is it? So I was actually in special ed for many years until grade 5. I had, my legs were the way that they sort of were formed when I was born. They were crooked, and then I ended up having to wear shoes shoes nailed to a board, and that's how I slept at night, to sort of straighten out my legs. And so I was never really good at sports. I realized later on in life, probably much of that was to deal with the fact that I have ADHD. I went through, and it's the only test that I ever passed with flying colors, and it was super easy. So what I realized was, with all of these things, right? Like, how is it that you go from one thing to the next and you move through sort of social classes, because that's a really challenging thing to go through, is, why is it that, and I hate to sort of think, but I reflect on myself, right? So why is it that I just keep going and pursuing things? Because I have that sort of gumption. I realize that there's, it's not just about grit. And that was taught to me by my dad. He would work all the time and do things all the time. That was taught to him by his grandparents or his parents that just worked in the field all the time. They just worked. And, the one thing that sort of keeps me going is having that, hey, I think that this is an important thing that matters, that gives me meaning, that, is something that other people actually need. And I think having that combination of those two things, of knowing, what is it that is happening? What's this big goal that you're pursuing? What is that? I think Collins talks about the BHAGs, the big, hairy, audacious goal, but it's not just about that, but it's willingness to get up and do things every day. And I think that's what we need to sort of focus on, is making sure that we have gumption. And I think that's how you get things started, is you have gumption, because you never have enough time. You never have enough resources. It always feels rinky-dinky. So what keeps you going is just gumption every single day. I think that's where I'm going to end this. All right. See you on the next chapter. Actually, I wanted to add a few more things here. I was just thinking about this. But the important thing is you have to feel good with just working all the time and being okay with just pursuing things that you think matter. And it might feel that it doesn't sort of fit in with what you're actually doing. And I wanted to add how important that is, where you have to feel pleasure in the work that you're actually doing to keep going at it. And the other thing that's really incredibly important is thinking about, like, why is it that you feel pleasure in the thing that you're doing? Is because you get some sort of meaning or feeling that this is the right thing that you should be doing at this moment, that there's, maybe it's yourself that you're healing, or somebody else that you're healing for them. And you realize it's important to the outside world. I think about, this is where the sort of religious components of life become very important. I'm not religious now, but growing up, it was an important part of my life. And I think about, why. And there's a sort of dichotomy of doing things but because it requires sacrifice, but getting meaning from this sacrifice, and doing things because you're sort of healing your inside, but at the same time helping out other people on the outside. And I think that combination, I think, is super important for why you actually have gumption. And it might not, very, very much so, not for me. It's not a religious thing anymore, but I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's a moral imperative that there's something right here to actually keep working at something. No matter, and the reason why it's important is because no matter what happens, the sort of negative things that you feel, you still keep going at it. So I think about Viktor Frankl, who is a psychiatrist, that was actually an Auschwitz survivor, or a concentration camp survivor. And he was sort of thinking about, why is it that people keep going in these, what keeps them going? And it's sort of all of this soft stuff when you're there, going through those negative experiences. And I think that is really important, is to have that meaning. It's not necessarily just working for the sake of working, or having grit for the sake of having grit. It's because you feel like there's some meaning there, that gumption is important to you. So I realized I didn't talk too much about why gumption is so important for innovation and entrepreneurship. And the reason is that when you're doing something that is different and distinct, and that is uncertain, and people don't understand it, they will not want to actually participate in any sort of way. Now, you have to come back to the reason, right? So people are going to be self-interested, and they're going to think about themselves. And most people, we know behaviorally, are very, they do uncertainty avoidance, and they don't often like risk. So risk and uncertainty, as Frank Knight pointed out in 1929, are different. So what that is, as the risk is kind of a known risk of something, known distribution or probability distribution for doing something. Uncertainty is doing something that you don't really know what the outcomes are. And then there's also ambiguity, where you don't even know what the outcomes actually are themselves. And all of these things, any of these sort of moments, makes it very difficult for people to like and sort of prefer these particular options. Behaviorally, we like a sure bet, where we know something is going to happen very quickly and very in sort of the next moment. So you'd expect that as individuals, that we're going to be very self-interested, because we know that is certain. It's much more certain than relying on somebody else that you can't necessarily trust. And so as for you, as you're building something, it doesn't matter whether it's an innovation, a product innovation, you're creating something new, or you are doing something entrepreneurial, creating a new firm, organization, whatever, you're going to get to a moment where you don't have a lot of support, and you have to figure out how to just do it yourself. And, one thing that I've learned repeatedly from my parents is you just get up and you just do it. And you don't wait for other people to come to the rescue. And that's kind of a tricky thing to realize, is that if you have this sort of big vision, this sort of big, sort of soft idea that's going to take maybe a decade, 2 decades, you have to look very far in advance. And people early on are not going to see what you're going to do. And so the only person that's actually going to be willing to do something is yourself. And that's where you have to have that sort of grit or willingness just to enjoy work, to pursue something, to do something that nobody else is going to pursue. You're going to be the one that's going to have to do all of the tasks, every single task, because you see where it's going to go. You're going to have to, as my parents would say, you have to sweep the floors and be happy with sweeping the floors. You have to do all of the tasks that you think would be below you, because nobody else is going to do it. You're the one that has to do it. Now, it's a lot like parenting, right? You think when you have a child that the kids would sort of do everything themselves, but it's not what happens at all. You discover that you have to be the one that steps up and takes responsibility and takes control of the situation, no matter what, particularly when they are very they're infants, or they don't really know. It's the same as a small startup business. Nobody knows what it is. You have to be the one that has to get going and pursue this thing and do everything in your repertoire of action to actually get something done. And that's going to take an awful lot of grit and gumption to pursue something. So the idea of having gumption, the idea that you're pursuing something that is got a long-term vision, just requires you to get up and keep doing it no matter what. And that is extremely important for entrepreneurial and innovative things.